Welcome everyone, my name is Mikey Mhenna. It is my honor to introduce our special guest. Tarek El-Ariss is the James Wright Professor at Dartmouth College and Guggenheim Fellow 2021-2022. Trained in philosophy and comparative literature and visual and cultural studies, he works across disciplines and languages to examine notions of the subject, community, and modernity in Arabic culture, literature, and art. His research interests include new media and cyberculture, literary theory and digital humanities, Al-Nahda and modernity studies, travel writing and the war novel, sci-fi and utopia studies, 18th century and 19th century French philosophy and literature, and gender and sexuality studies. He's the author of Trials of Arab Modernity, Literary Affects and the New Political, and Leaks, Hacks, and Scandals, Arab Culture in the Digital Age, and editor of the MLA anthology, The Arab Renaissance, a bilingual anthology of the Nahda. Tarek, welcome to afikra.
Thank you, Mikey, for this generous introduction and for bringing me into this community that I also have been following with great admiration and appreciation. Thank you for everything you're doing and for also everyone who's joining us today.
Thank you. The honor is ours. Okay, so Tarek, I was joking with you before the call that if you don't have the word modernity tattooed on your body somewhere, I feel like you have to, because it seems to be the overarching subject of your work and almost an obsession. And so let's go back to earlier days when you were first studying at AUB. When did you first start becoming intellectually consumed with this idea of what modernity means in the context of the 18th and 19th century and 20th century in the Arab world?
You know, my interest in the Nahda starts in Nadim Naimi's course about the Nahda at AUB. So it starts from there. But at AUB, I was also interested in questions of philosophy. I was really philosophy major. And little by little, the questions of the Nahda and how to think about Arab modernity or being modern started to take more place in my intellectual project. At the beginning, I was really interested in theories, philosophy, psychoanalysis, deconstruction. I came to the US in the 90s at the height of theory and also post-colonial theory, the work of Edward Said. I discovered the whole critique of Orientalism and so on. And little by little, I started seeing that, well, one of the things that the kind of the Orientalists have been practicing is this denial of our modernity, of Middle Eastern modernity. And little by little, I started discovering that we have in the Middle East, not only in the Middle East, I would say in the global South, a tradition of modernity. Usually the word tradition and modernity, they don't go together, right? Because you would think tradition is the opposite of modernity, but we actually have, you know, debates, books dealing with the veil, dealing with democracy, dealing with whether secularism and should be the basis of a modern state. And these debates are already happening in the 1800s. They're happening in Beirut, they're happening in Cairo, they're happening all over the region. But all of a sudden, you know, here we are in the 90s and 2000s, and we forget about this. And we think now, all of a sudden, we're connected to the world through satellite television or cheap gas that allows us to fly from, you know, I'm talking at the beginning of the 90s, this kind of globalization that starts to take hold. So I begin to be interested in this question of modernity to first confront some of the discourses, especially coming to America as someone from Lebanon, where people, of course, have some prejudices sometimes about where you come from and what you do. And of course, to confront certain critiques that want to place you in the past, that want to place you in, you know, some fundamentalist, unchanging box that, of course, is opposite to what you have experienced.
So here's a question for you. Let's say you're speaking to your 17-year-old nephew, niece, and they're saying, oh, you know, we want they start using the word modern in maybe what you think is a quite lazy way, right? Oh, I just bought a new, I wish things in Beirut were more modern. What is your sort of your cheeky but I think more accurate definition of what modern is?
Well, I mean, the cheeky definition is that I'm breaking with some sort of norm, some sort of order that has been imposed on me, that has imposed a worldview on me, that has imposed a way of thinking on me. Of course, we can go back to Immanuel Kant's definition of the Enlightenment. What is the Enlightenment? It's almost becoming, coming to yourself, becoming conscious of yourself as someone who can make choices for her or his own, So there is something about the modern that has a little bit about, there is a little experimentation, there is a little rebellion, there is a little awareness of yourself and pushing back against something that is imposed on you. But what I'm really interested in is also how the understanding of our part of the world as being outside of this rebellious, cheeky, innovative, progressive model. So I'm really interested in kind of saying we have a tradition of modernity that is not just simply starts in France and Germany or England, that there is something modern about about places like Beirut and the area that we come from. So, and we use it in Arabic. We say modern. Hello, of course we use it. If we go back to the Lebanese context, modern means you go to the beach, right? Or you espouse certain way of being in the world that might come from a particular tradition. And I trace that tradition, of course, to the 19th century, but of course we can trace it beyond that.
Yeah. You mentioned France. I want to ask you two simple questions that don't have simple answers. And the first one is, when did the Nahda start, and why did it not start in the photo, in the image being depicted here?
Well, I mean, to kind of come back to my definition of modernity, I say modernity is not just simply, in Arabic, the word has become known as hadatha, hadith, something is modern, new. There is the idea of newness. But I come and say, no, modernity is not just hadatha, it is ahdath and hawadith. So it is also major events. Of course, the way we refer to the Lebanese civil war is al-ahdath, or the hawadith, like things that that had a major influence on the way we think of ourselves in the world, but we can't really name something specific. We can't. And Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, that this picture a part is depicting, is an event, is a hadath, it's an event, right? So it is already in the hadatha that has become the moment that many historians, many critics said, oh, this is when the Nahda starts. Like somehow Napoleon awakened us from our slumber, from our inhitat, what is called in Arabic inhitat. So because the idea of the Nahda, of awakening, assumes that before that you were sleeping or dead or not around. So somehow this 1798 Napoleon's invasion of Egypt somehow is this kind of moment of awakening. We woke us up, but very violently, with cannons and printing presses and armies and a new way of thinking.
Yeah.
Of course, this is a very important moment, but that moment in itself is not, I don't think causally, it is not the cause of the Nahda. It is one of very important moments, events that I think the Nahda that has contributed to the Nahda in direct and indirect ways. But it is one of many, of course, but it has become this, watershed event that started this process.
So the companion question obviously is, and when did it end, and has it ended?
Well, I mean, this is a big question that I keep, that my work is really invested in. I mean, my last book is on the digital culture. but it's really what happens to the Nahda in the digital age. Because, I mean, the Nahda or the project of Arab cultural and political modernity, it's a way of thinking of yourself in the world, in a world that has changed radically. All of a sudden, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing in the 19th century. The colonialism was there, printing press was there. And of course, if we think about it today, you know, with the digital, with major transformations, of course, that makes us rethink our place in the world as a community. And of course, so there is something about that Nahda thought that wants to, like, how do I find my place in the world? How do I tell stories? How do I write my history? How do I think of a political system that represents me as a community? So these questions are still with us. And in that sense, I feel like and of course the circulation, I mean, the Nahda is really starts with you know, Reuters comes to Beirut, you know, the cables. People are following what's happening all over the world because of the telegraph, because of cables. So of course you can say with new media, with the internet, I mean, these are similar technological developments that now makes us feel part of a more global place. So something about that Nahda continues, but in the Nahda, people were also thinking about the state, about building a state, about a state as something that will save us, as something that will make us fulfill our destiny. Of course, a lot of European thinkers and also are thinking about these questions. And you have new states that emerge in the 19th century, like Germany, like Italy. So all of a sudden, the nation state becomes the kind of receptacle, becomes that which allows a community to assert itself on the world stage, but also to enter history, if one kind of go into Hegel and Renan and these thinkers of history and the nation. So I think, you know, the 19th century people had, you know, there was a Nahda that was purely cultural, but there were people obviously looking like, okay, what do we do now that this Ottoman Empire doesn't seem to be able to protect itself? Of course, you talked about Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, or that is also, you know, you have the Young Turks, you have various nationalisms, ethno-nationalisms that are emerging. And today, of course, the question is, is there a state building project?
Yeah. Before we get to the state building project, I want to get to it with the hammer on the nail on its head. But sure. I want to go back to the sort of 1800s real quick. So in your book, you have a lot of names. This is the Arab Renaissance book, which is an anthology, bilingual, with enormous care given towards the translation. But I show this screen on this image on the screen. For those of you who can't see it, there's about maybe about 20 names on the screen. And I'm going to now turn to a quote that you mentioned in an interview I heard that you gave, where you said that these people, quote, they were aware that there is a new century and they have to be a part of it. So my question to you is, are they working, these people that are aware, are they communally aware? Is this a movement happening in Egypt and in the Levant, Greater Syria, that is happening in conjunction, where they are all thinking about progress, modernity, the nation, culture, education? Are they thinking about this all in the same terms, or are there it's not a homogenous group and it's not a coordinated group?
A lot of them are talking, but of course it's not homogeneous in this, but they are aware of each other. There are journals. I mean, just like, look, today you have websites, you have this forum that you are, part of. I mean, you have forums, and so it's like satellites. And sometimes there are people thinking around certain journals, having debates, contesting each other's work. So there is an awareness of a community of thinkers that are interested in similar questions about the subject, who are the individual, questions of language, questions of representation, of dress, of politics. So they're aware that they are agents that have a role to think and engage and they can make a change. There is this question of agency that becomes really important, that all of a sudden, I'm not simply crushed by whatever political system, patriarchal system. I have a voice, and that voice, I'm going to use it to contribute an article and publish it in this journal that comes out of Beirut, but it's also going to be read in Cairo, because those journals are going to go by ship from the Beirut port to Alexandria, and it's going to be available there in a certain period of time. So you're connected. There is a diaspora. There are people who are in exile. Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, like a lot of people now who are in Europe. Faris al-Shidyaq is in Istanbul. He has his own press in Istanbul. So you also have a network of people publishing, writing. So they are aware. Of course, maybe there are different debates. Some of them debates about tradition, about politics, about colonialism, but they are interconnected. And there are journals and thinkers around which some of these debates have coalesced. And this is what the Nahda anthology tries to do, is to kind of showcase a little bit some of these debates and some of these also journals. Like there is a whole section on these, newspapers that come out of Beirut, in the 19th century.
So maybe there's a good time to go back to the question of the nation building. So I heard you reference Rafi al-Hariri in the 1990s. You said that you were coming of age in the 90s in Beirut, and after the Civil War, he very famously said, it's time for us to rejoin sort of the modern world, to be I forget the quote, to be a part of tomorrow or something like that. And that type of rhetoric is like overwhelmingly loud in the GCC right now.
Yeah.
This idea of being a part of tomorrow, not only being a part of it, but defining tomorrow through nation building.
Yeah. So, okay. So this is a very complicated.
Yeah, of course.
Because, so what I was referring to is that in the 90s, you have this notion that we're going to enter the future.
Yeah.
But at what price? And what does that mean in terms of your relation to the past? Because in the 19th century, in the Nahda, they weren't just entering the future. They were going back and retrieving, Fairuz Abadi. They were retrieving the classics of Arabic literature, of the dictionaries, the encyclopedias. They were retrieving, they're re-editing. Every Nahda thinker is involved in some sort of re-editing of that particular tradition, and to use it to understand the present. So it is not a break. And so I wonder if the moment that we enter into, starting in the 90s, is that there is this idea that you can leave the past behind, or you don't need the past anymore, and you can somehow recreate yourself through this only future-looking attitude. And of course, if we think of nations and nation building is the future has to somehow continue something that happened in the past. So the theories of the nation from the 19th century is kind of charting a trajectory that moves you from the past through the present into the future. So, but what if you've somehow made this break with the past and you're only looking at the future? Is it still nation building the way we understand it, the way political scientists have understood it, the way Arab nationalism has understood it, the way Nahda thinkers have understood it? This is a big question. Obviously we need maybe some distance to make those determinations, but there is definitely this attempt that the future is going to somehow save us, or it is a destination that we're heading to without really processing this kind of building. And I say institution building, including institution building that connects, processes, synthesizes, teaches, where we are in the present and also where we have come from. Because it's like a yoga pose, right? Like in order for you to hold the yoga pose, you need to really get
have a strong base.
Exactly. You have to have a strong base so you can last in that you know,
Power, warrior one.
exactly.
Okay.
You need to work on your foundation. I mean, this is Iyengar, of course, but this is very important. And I wonder if
Yeah.
what we are seeing today is not taking us, you know, in some direction without, you know, without really understanding exactly where and
Yeah.
what its relation to the present and the past.
Perfect. This is a perfect segue into. There are three, just for the viewers, there are three folks from this list that I sort of picked out that I wanted to talk about. The first one is Bustani, Butrus Bustani, who is this sort of huge, gigantic figure in the Nahda, revolutionary sort of educator, and it doesn't seem that he was concerned with nation building. But he was interested in sort of like laying down the shackles of our past and moving forward. So tell us a little bit about why he wasn't concerned with nation building in this specific way, but what he was particularly concerned with.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, Bustani, a lot of the Beirut intellectuals were many of them were pan-Ottoman, you know, like they were not.
Yeah, look at what he's wearing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but I mean that people wore this. So Bustani, you know, who, although there is a discourse on, I mean, he founded something called al-Madrasa al-Wataniya. So the national school, which still exists, the building still exists in Zaqlablat today in Beirut. And it attracted people from across sects. It wasn't just simply, you know, it kind of transcended sectarian, you know, sectarian divisions. Al-Bustani, of course, was interested in, he understood that Arabic, first of all, what Bustani did is really the kind of the contribution to the Arabic language, to modernizing the Arabic language, but also to come up with educational system, to come up with models of community that transcend sectarianism. And of course, Bustani was also eventually responding to the 1860s, the hawadith and ahdath of the 1860s, to the, you know, civil war, genocidal war against, you know, against Christians in the mountains in Damascus, you know, in a very, you know, very important moment that also Bustani, who writes Nafir Suriya, the clarion of Syria, to say, how do we also build a society that prevents us from killing each other? That allow us
to that was, what was his answer to that?
Well, it is, again, you know, the educational model, the cultural model, is fundamental for Bustani. How do you create a vision, or you kind of, I mean, in Khutbah fi Adab al-Arab, the one, you know, in the lecture on the culture of Arabs, the one that is in the anthology, he goes and says, in this village, this family has transformed this monastery into a school. And in this other village, this family has given this land to create, you know, a school to teach girls, or there is this printing press that is publishing. I mean, he does this, you know, he does this repertoire of all these, you know, these cultural transformations that are pushing people to think, to write, to learn. And of course, for these people, like, salvation is not the nation as in the nation state, but it is through enlightenment. I mean, for lack of a better word, through you know, through a form of education that allows them to transcend the regional, sectarian, and think of a community of readers and thinkers and builders together.
Okay, I'm going to keep on moving. We could spend, you know, tens of hours talking about Bustani alone. I want to talk about somebody who I was unaware of, Esther al-Azhari, Moyal. Who is this person, and why have I never heard of her?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, the Nahda in general has not gotten its fair share of critical attention, let alone Nahda women from the Nahda, and let alone Jewish women from Beirut. So the level of exclusion is really multiple here, and working at and this is part of the anthology, is that So this Nahda is not just simply, okay, Bustani or Tahtawi, or like the kind of famous figures that we know of, but there are all these people that are journalists, translators, activists. I mean, and this is Azhari Moyal, Esther Azhari, who's from Beirut, and who's extremely educated. She translates Émile Zola's biography. She compares Émile Zola and his defense of Dreyfus, Alfred Dreyfus, to Al-Mutanabbi. And here she does this comparison. She's reading Mutanabbi and saying, Émile Zola and his J'accuse is acting like Mutanabbi, on his horse. So, I mean, here you have going back to the Arabic poetry, to the classical poetry, in order to explain to her readers some of what she is seeing. This is someone who was extremely active in intellectual and literary circles across the region. Eventually, she moves to Palestine. She marries a doctor, also a publisher, an intellectual, Moyal, and then eventually she has a very important role to play in the Nahda, and she brings, she's not just simply talking about women's issues. She's not simply talking about being Jewish from the region. She's also discussing what is the new role of the intellectual, for instance. I mean, this is really the contribution is to the way we think about literature and culture in a larger context. And that's very important. So she's not just simply, it's not reduced only to her gender or ethnic identity. It is also transcending this to...
So at the time she's like this Meziyede type character. She was important in the moment as Meziyede was important in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, these are different also circles. And Esther Azhari, she actually leaves, Beirut at some point, and then she lives in other places. So Meziyede is in Cairo, of course. Meziyede, we know Meziyede just because of the all the
Gibran connection and...
Of course, and all the connections of Meziyede, but Esther Azhari was not. I mean, Meziyede is part of. I don't want to say part of the. I mean, we know her. We grow up learning a little bit. If we know anything about Nahda women, Meziyede is the name that usually pops up. But there is Zainab Fawaz. There is Labiba Hashim. You have and I include many of these women in the anthology because their work has not again received the attention that it deserves as Nahda agents. And this is very important. So they're not just there, talking about women's rights. They're there really contributing to the way we think of modernity as such. And their contribution has not, and I would like people to go back and do more research about these women and other people who have been excluded from the narrative.
Okay, one last person that I wanted to call out was this person. And the reason why I wanted to talk about him was two reasons. One is because I want to talk about the medium of the travelogue, the sort of that as an entire medium and its importance in the role it plays in the book, but it's also broader importance, why these things are studied for those of us who are unfamiliar with this type of thing, and two, why this person's work in general helps us understand or sort of reimagine our relation with the West versus the East. So if you can talk about both of those, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, obviously travel and this kind of connectivity, if you like, that we think about in the Nahda is extremely important. And many of these thinkers, they travel. Many of them are able to travel. I mean, all of a sudden you have also a technology that allows you to move outside of your, regional places. But also, I mean, Muhammad Abduh was exiled. Also, a lot of people suffer political, because they cross whoever is in power at the time, or the ideas seem, non-desired. So they exiled them. Many of them are in Europe, some of them are in Istanbul. Muhammad Abduh comes to Beirut for a while. So the idea of travel, either voluntary or not, is of course, like we think of travel in general, is a form of opening, is a form of encounter that gets you outside, that changes your perspective. I mean, pretty much the way we think of travel till this day. And of course, Muhammad Abduh's travel, he goes into churches in Europe, and this is what I have in the anthology, in Sicily, and he's describing the inside, who built them. He starts talking about the Muslim heritage in Sicily. I mean, all of a sudden, the travel becomes this history of East-West encounters at so many levels, both in the 19th century when he's there, or beginning of the 20th, but also going back to Norman Sicily and the Andalusian period, in Spain and so on. So here you have this travel that is physical, that is in the present, is also connecting at the historical level. It is also writing a common narrative that might not be one of conflict and confrontation or mutual exclusivity, but might be maybe being one of continuity in some sort. And who does that? I mean, earlier you asked me about the end of the Nahda.
Yeah.
And some of the last, actually, there's, some of the last people that we normally associate with the Nahda is Taha Hussein.
Yeah.
Taha Hussein, who was the, major Egyptian thinker, intellectual, author. He wrote Al-Ayyam, but he also wrote this wonderful essay called Mustaqbal al-Thaqafa fi Masr, the future of culture in Egypt. And he says, well, I mean, look at Alexandria. It's Greek, right? I mean, how can you create these breaks? So this notion, this Mediterranean connection between Europe, North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, this is this constant crossing that has been taking place for centuries. So the idea of thinking of breaks or radical opposition in the name of tradition or in the name of authenticity is totally doesn't make any sense.
So but Tarek, one of the other reasons why I was interested is that this guy is not only sort of in dialogue with Western Europe and North America, but he's also in dialogue with Russia, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this was a surprise to me.
Yeah, I mean, we forget that Mikhail Naimi, studies in Russia, Lebanese author. And I have like this selection from Sab'un, from his, kind of autobiographical, where he's reading Russian poets and Russian literature, and he becomes aware of his own poetic and literary sensitivity by reading the Russians. And of course, who is like the superstar author of the time? It's Tolstoy. Tolstoy, I mean, we read Tolstoy now, but at the time, Tolstoy was like, I don't know, maybe what Jean-Paul Sartre was in the 60s. He was like one of those superstar international author, academic, activist, embracing causes, critiquing the ruling class in Russia, defending peasants, I mean, someone who was engaged at multiple levels. And of course, Tolstoy was not just, was being, people in Egypt were also aware of what Tolstoy was doing and how Tolstoy was being excommunicated and so on. And just like eventually, these affairs, these events are now not just simply happening where they are also reverberating. So you have this kind of more global connection that I think the Nahda has already started, and is not something new. So of course here Tahtawi is, Muhammad Abduh is corresponding with Tolstoy, and there are other kind of people going to Russia to study. I mean, you have a lot of Russian schools in Palestine and Lebanon, also forming people.
Okay, I want to talk about technology. You already sort of mentioned it, because I remember when we first started talking, when I invited you on the show, I told you that I looked at your books and I said, okay, there are 2 books about the Nahda, and then 1 book about about Twitter and leaks. But clearly that's not true. So this photo that I have on the screen is, I believe, one of the first printing presses in the Arab world, which you've already alluded to is, goes hand in hand with the ability to get ideas out, right? It's not necessarily that the ideas are not there,
Yeah.
but it's all of a sudden the communication and the sort of feedback loops are possible because you can start hearing other people's ideas. Obviously, that is happening now, right? In today's digital age, clearly, the exchange of information has never been faster.
Yeah.
And so walk us through, if you were trying to explain it to like a 17-year-old, what is the sort of interest in writing this book?
Mhm. Well, I mean, the interest, if to start, I'm a scholar of modernity. So I started, but modernity is a constellation. It's the novel, it is a certain concept of the nation and so on. So I started seeing phenomena and critiques of power and forms of writing, things that make up this understanding of where we are today as a community. What we stand for, how do we protest, how do we use our voice, how do we activate our agency to make a change in the world. So these are the questions that I started engaging in this book and looking at this kind of, I started getting interested in, blogs turned novels. I was served as editors for various presses. So I was interested in experimentation and new writing, in new way of thinking that have to do with technological changes that started really in the 90s with the advent of the internet, satellite television, and then of course went to a whole other level in the new millennium, with the social media and so on. So this book is really how do we, is this a Nahda moment? I mean, to come back to your earlier question, is this a Nahda moment? Are we, what are the kind of comparisons? How do we are we imagining ourselves as a community? And of course, the Arab Spring is 2010 is really like the elephant a little bit in the room, because that's also a moment that has come and really opened up possibilities, but also brought with it its own, its own disappointments and entrenchments, actually, and worsening in some cases of situations, political, social, and otherwise, and producing refugee crisis and so on, like have been major. So this is also a book that's trying also to deal with these historical events and to ask these questions, and also to ask about the place of Europe, because modernity was very much Europe kind of in dialogue with, and I don't think we are there today. I think that the conversation has just, we're no longer living in the shadow of, the colonial metropoles of Paris and London, So I think also this is, the reference points have also shifted. And of course, the role of the Gulf culturally, politically, starting, in the new millennium, especially, I mean, has also, we can't think simply of Arabic culture and literature. Usually Beirut and Cairo were kind of big centers, and now things have moved in various ways, and we have to think about Arabic culture and forms of sponsorship and the kind of institutions that underlie it with this in mind. That is not necessarily linked to a modernity project the way we traditionally think of the Nahda. So this is what this book is trying to do, is trying to take into account these historical shifts and technological developments.
So one question before we get to the quick Q&A, much like Bustani was trying to define a new modern standard Arabic, and that sort of gave way, maybe not gave way, but that was part of this new moment or event of publishing, right? All of a sudden, there was a new tool to use. And it wasn't just him. There were lots of people who are sort of working and thinking through this idea. Is there a sort of a modern standard Arabic again happening, or a more modern standard Arabic that's happening that could give, I hate the word more modern, sorry, scratch that from the record, but a sort of a similar process that's going through that's happening right now?
I don't know. I mean, I think actually, to be honest, some people don't like what's happening right now because they think that Arabic is if you stick to a more pan-Arab understanding of Arabic and protecting Arabic and so on, then you don't necessarily like what we're seeing. But I think the more we write, and the more we write in in Arabic, but also in various dialects and various forms, the more the language thrives and the better it is. And I feel like we are writing a lot today, although we talk also about lack of reading, that people read very little and so on. So one has to not be, we can't be too dismissive also of all the writing and posting and texting that we do. And I think, and I the idea of kind of unifying Arabic or coming up with one language and one form and that we all speak and read in one way is also not very useful, because it is going to limit some sort of play and diversity. And I like these shows today where people come on the shows and they speak their Arabic coming from various parts of the region, and people are forced somehow to translate and understand and recognize different accents and different dialects. And I think that's enriching. And I think it's even more enriching when you see it also written and so on. So I actually, I don't see this kind of unifying project of the language, but or the language as being necessarily the kind of conduit to progress or to enlightenment or what have you. But I think this kind of diversity we're seeing with the new media, I think is extremely healthy.
Okay, we're going to do a quick Q&A and then open up to questions. All right, so I'm going to try to cut you off quickly. So what are you reading or watching right now?
I'm reading a lot of memoirs right now. So, from old memoirs like, the Confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau to more contemporary work. So I'm reading a lot of memoirs because I'm interested in this topic and I'm working on this. Watching, oh no, please don't ask me what I'm watching. I try to stay away. I try to stay away from watching, because once I start one of those series, I can't stop and it's terrible and I get in trouble and I have to binge on it. So, some HBO, some, obviously, yeah.
Okay. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Oh my God. Wow. Who would I? Shidyak, Ahmed Faris Shidyak.
Okay, why?
Well, he's one of my Nahda heroes. So, and I think he's awesome and brilliant and also a little bit crazy. So I would love to, just kind of watch his writings, rhythm, and I've written a lot about his, the interior, how he writes, how he eats, and the kind of. So I've been very interested in this. There's a whole chapter in my first book on Shidyak.
I wanted to ask you this for a second thought. Of all the people, who do you think, because you're a very funny writer, you don't mean to be, or you don't advertise it as such, but you're a very funny writer. I hear the humor in your work. Who do you think is the funniest of the writers that you are in the book?
In my book, I mean, again, I think he's really great. I mean, there's this Egyptian author that I also wrote about called Hamdi Abu Glayl, and I think he's absolutely hilarious. I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, the way he constructs his, you can tell sometimes the humor of the people, and you can kind of connect with it. Yeah.
Okay, what do people most misunderstand about your work?
Oh, Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think in general, people do understand because I really work very hard on
To
trying
create understanding.
on taking it to, taking the readers into account and not be necessarily evasive or abstract. So I mean, I don't know. I guess it depends on yeah, I mean, this is a hard question for me.
Yeah.
But usually, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to open up to questions. Kareem sent it just to me, which usually means that he wants me to read it. So I'm going to read his question for him. The question
actually
is,
ask it. I don't mind asking it.
Okay, great. Go
Sorry.
ahead.
Thanks for coming to speak to us. Thought it's good to see you again.
Good to see you again.
Well, I was just thinking about the latest conflict in Gaza, and the use of digital media and how that kind of changed everything. And I was just wondering how has the use of digital media affected the concept of modernity in Palestine and even the rest of the world, especially as it relates to the idea of resistance?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the idea of decentralizing representation has been very important, because now it's no longer, you're not just simply fighting over coverage, like, okay, which is, centered around traditionally certain networks who will get the image out and so on. And now you have this decentralization of coverage, of versions, of narratives that might circulate and have a life of their own. I mean, and you have the kind of traditional media going to people's Twitter accounts to report from what people on the ground are seeing. So I think this has been very, very important. And this is something that is also important in terms of publication. I mean, people before, you had more centralized, like, okay, if certain books need to be published in certain presses and reviewed in certain journals for them to have presence. And now you have a much wider sites of publication and so on. So there is something about the decentralization where that has helped people and offered them perspective in ways that were not possible in the past. So, I mean, it's a larger conversation, Kareem, but this is probably like a little suggestions in that direction.
Okay, great, Kareem. Next question is from Ria. There is a pressure on people of the global south that wasn't an issue at the time of the original Nahda to create their own version of modern. So anything we do, it says that is built on existing Western thought and is accused as being colonial thinking, or tishbah al-gharb. That takes away from our identity in favor of a cheap imitation of colonial cultural norms. But in contrast, when Western thinkers built science or art that was built on Arab or Muslim thought from the Golden Age, they were never accused of selling out. How do you start understanding or expressing modern thought that may have a basis in Western sources without putting in question the validity of a culture or cultural identity?
Yeah, I mean, this is really, I think, I mean, I don't believe in authenticity. I think authenticity is a very romantic and very dangerous model. So I think we're always taking from each other. But the question is how we take. And this is Gibran, and this is in the anthology, has a beautiful article called Mustaqbal al-Lugha al-Arabiyya, the future of Arabic language. And he says, Arabic culture, its relation to the West, it's like food. If you don't chew the food, it is going to poison you. It might actually hurt your stomach. So when you take from something, you have to process it. You have to chew it so that it turns into nutrients. So you activate it and it turns into something that builds you, that reinforces you, rather than something that might hurt you. So I think it is not in the why or the what, but it is in the how. And I think it's very important that we don't see ourselves as being like some island, that starts in, in Arabia somehow and has been, corrupted or whatever. I mean, we are part of this, this continuum, and they are part of it too. And this is something that I'm very interested in my work, so I feel like it's how things are done, and to stay away, because because of the political conflict often and colonialism, it's generated these notions to somehow translate these oppositions culturally and historically, and how so okay, they're fighting in the present, therefore they've always been fighting, and therefore they're somehow their values are opposed or their cultures are opposed. And unfortunately, we struggle with this in the US, especially because that's people how they want to view us, as being outside, opposite, and so on. So the part of the resistance is to break down that model, that binary opposition, and to kind of enter into dialogue with these things. And I studied something called comparative literature. So I'm kind of very interested and invested in kind of seeing a broader picture.
Yeah. There's a beautiful 5-part video essay called "Everything is a Remix" on YouTube. That speaks to this idea. It's really, really beautiful. I highly recommend that people check it out. Okay, last question from Mariana. How would you define nation building? What are its pillars? And do we have good examples or models of nation building to sort of follow or to look at and to learn from?
Yeah, I mean, I think nation building, I mean, if you look at obviously, like the theories of the nation, right, have been, a lot of Nahda thinkers have thought about it, political thinkers from the 20th century through various political ideologies, but also Europeans thinking about nations, institutions. I mean, I come back to notions of institutions. I mean, this is really very important. And the kind of institutions that you want to create that will last into the future. I mean, this is how, I don't know, Michel Foucault understands the history of nation and nation building. So I think it's very important to also to look at the kind of institutions that are being built. And this is where I think is the framework. Of course, coming from the region, as many of us do, we need to work on getting the nation to as efficient, transparent, democratic, place as possible. But also we need to also do the things, but we can't wait for the nation, and the nation to come together and be somehow perfect and so on in order for us to engage. I mean, we can't, because obviously there is something that is not, like the nation also cannot be the only thing that saves us. It cannot only be the only kind of vehicle of salvation for the way we understand ourselves as a community. So we need to also make room, and this is something obviously, we do, but at a great price and at a great sacrifice, and sometimes it collapses, like we see in certain places in the region. Your ability to practice your agency, to contribute, to intervene, to start a website, to write the book, to engage. I mean, sometimes you are hit again, you are stopped by larger forces that you cannot control. But we need to do that as well, and we cannot wait also for the nation somehow to be whole and effective according to some ideal model.
Perfect. I'm going to just ask the final question before I let you go. When is the next book coming out?
I think it'll come out in 2023.
Okay, so we'll have to have you back on sooner rather than later. Tarek, this was really, really fun. I feel like these are one of the conversations where I walk out with more questions than I walked in with. But thank you for all of your work that you're doing. It's really powerful stuff. Thank you to everyone who joined. I hope you enjoyed today's talk. We have 2 more conversations this week, tomorrow and the next day. This will go up on our YouTube page and on our podcast in a couple days. If you don't already subscribe to those things, please subscribe. Just hit the subscribe button. Tell your friends about it. It helps broaden the community and broaden the types of questions that show up. Thanks again, and talk to you all soon. Thanks, everybody.